a real pleasure to say to the Human Relations Workshop, this is Dr. Morton Sobel.
Thank you.
Now, one more thing that I want to say first. We are going to reconvene at 1 o'clock here.
A friend of mine did a doctoral dissertation a few years ago in which she determined that in the Detroit public school system, the average length of time for any innovation to become a part of the practical usage into the Detroit public schools was about 50 years. That from the time that someone comes up with a new idea, a new notion, it takes about 50 years. Until it takes effect. And I want you to know that for the last 4 years, Detroit has called its intermediate schools junior high schools. No, they just caught up. These things kind of frighten me. For one thing, they're both going to keep me in one place, which is a little unusual for me. The other thing is, I don't know whether you've ever had the experience of having a talk you presented recorded and then having to read the transcript. It makes you sound like a complete nincompoop because you don't finish any sentences, you don't make any pertinent points in clear, forthright fashion. So they both frighten me just a little bit. And
cut it off.
oh no, it doesn't frighten me that much. All right, fine. This is a good kind of coming home experience for me. I finished directing a couple of workshops at Rutgers earlier this summer, in which we had people in the first one who were community leaders. We only had, out of 43, 44 people, we only had about 4 teachers and principals. The second workshop was on intergroup relations aspects of urban redevelopment, and we had a flock of professionals from housing planning, redevelopment, intergroup agencies, and again, very few teachers. Last week I was at Ohio State for the National Student Association. These were all students. Now, the typical workshop with which I've had experience is primarily composed of people involved in education, so I feel very much at home here. At the same time, I recognize that some of you are not directly involved in administration or teaching or supervision. And I have to make an apology to you by suggesting that what I have to say will be geared primarily in terms of schools and teachers and administrators and their responsibilities in intergroup relations or in human relations. And if you will try to transpose this into your own terms so that it's applicable to your job and to your interests and your concerns, I hope this will be suitable. It's a bad policy, I guess, to apologize first, but you just can't suit everybody, I guess is what I'm saying. Let me give you a couple of definitions first so that you'll understand what I mean when I use the terms prejudice and discrimination. Because I suspect that different people use these terms interchangeably when they are, in my view at least, quite different. People use them as if they were very different kinds of things than what I conceive them to be. So in order to set a kind of a background, I'll give you what I consider these two terms fundamentally to mean. Prejudice is literally a prejudgment based on an insufficient quantity of facts. It's a very personal kind of thing. It's a set of values or beliefs or attitudes or feeling tones which are my own personal property. In the intergroup relations and human relations field, they're very often used. Prejudice is often conceived to be a negative kind of thing. That is, where we downgrade someone else. Our prejudgments about other groups which are not my group tend to be, if not derogatory, at least setting up status differences between my group and other groups. Obviously, the prejudices that I have about my group are very positive ones because we're all good guys. You know, we're the ones who wear the white hats. I think it's important that we recognize that there is a matter of insufficient quantity of facts. One of the problems about being in the human relations field is that everybody is an expert in human relations. I was just talking with somebody the other day about the problem of traveling on a plane or on a train, and I sit down next to a shoelace salesman, and he's been on the road for 2 weeks, and he's an awful lonesome guy, and he wants to talk. So he tells me all about the shoelace industry, and then he asks me what I do. All the time he's been talking about selling shoelaces, I haven't said a word because I don't know much except that they come in 18 inches or 27 inches or whatever it is. First of all, I have a rather serious problem in describing to him what I do, and once I get the idea through, once I do get the idea across, then he lectures me, you see, on human relations and what it means. In most instances, the people who lecture me about this have really a very insufficient quantity of facts. Every one of us has had some kind of experience, either directly or indirectly, with someone who is different than he is, with someone of a different religious faith or a different racial group or a different nationality group or a different social class group, and we know all about them on the basis of this experience. Unfortunately, I think most of the statements cannot really be scientifically documented. If for no other reason than many of these experiences are something that we've seen on television or heard on the radio or seen in some mass media communication instrument or something of that kind. So, prejudice then is this prejudgment without a sufficient quantity of facts or with sometimes inaccurate facts. From these we draw, I can't remember the names of the two words that you were using, but sometimes we read into or read out of something, whatever. Oh, you sure were appearing scholarly. Far more scholarly than I can absorb. I hope you'll write those down later so that I can use them sometime to appear scholarly. Now, the other term that we sometimes get a little bollocksed up with is the term discrimination. Discrimination, as I view it, is an act. It's something that we do to restrict opportunities for somebody else. Or sometimes it's something that we don't do. And the very act of not doing something can be an act of doing something. For example, if on the block where I live, somebody decides to organize a neighborhood improvement association to keep out certain kinds of people, I may be very virtuous and say, these are terrible people. They're setting up discriminatory barriers. Ain't it awful? And I say, as a consequence, I'm not going to join this organization. But if I, as an individual, do nothing to frustrate the un-American, un-Christian, undemocratic, indecent efforts upon which they are embarking, if I do nothing about this, then I am committing an act of discrimination. I think one of the problems with us good people, with us do-gooders, is that all too often we think that because we don't support the George Lincoln Rockwells or the Gerald L.K. Smiths or the Merwin K. Harts or the Joe Camps or the John Caspers, we think that we're being very virtuous, very good guys because we don't take these kinds of overt acts. What I'm suggesting is that because we don't do anything to frustrate their efforts, we are committing acts of discrimination. Now, I think as a broad generalization, most people who are prejudiced or who have prejudices tend to put these into action, to translate these into action, into acts of discrimination. I think this is a fairly general kind of thing. However, I would suggest that there are some people with relatively few prejudices who nevertheless commit acts of discrimination, and there are people who have prejudices who do not necessarily translate them into discriminatory acts. Let me give you some examples. I know a man who owns a bowling alley, and this man says that while he probably has no prejudices, and I think I've read scientific research which indicates that there are people without intergroup prejudices, and I'm perfectly willing to believe scientific research indicating that this is so. I must add, however, that I personally have never met anybody, starting with myself, who is completely free of intergroup prejudices. Now, I know the group or groups against whom I have prejudices, and I try to deal with these within myself. Besides, I need these prejudices to keep me warm. See, they fulfill certain functions for me. They're defense mechanisms with which, if I didn't have them, I would probably do something else that's even worse. As long as I don't act these out, you see, I'm relatively untainted. This man I would consider to be relatively unprejudiced. Nevertheless, he will not permit Negroes to come into his bowling alley. Not because they get drunk and disorderly, not because they don't pay their bowling line fees, not because they loft the ball into the middle of the alley, but because he's afraid he's going to lose his already existing white business, or business composed of white clientele. I always get mixed up on this business of white. It should really be pink, of course, but we get all messed up here. Now, this is a man whom I consider to be a relatively unprejudiced discriminator. At the same time, we have states in the United States, some 21 of them, which have passed acts or ordinances or laws which say you may not employ or refuse to employ someone on the basis of race, religion, national origin. Merit and ability is the primary factor. Michigan has had this kind of a law since 1955, and I am absolutely certain that there are a number of persons in the state of Michigan who employ individuals whom they would rather not employ. They really have prejudices against some of these minority groups. But their motivation is to be law-abiding citizens. Their motivation is to stay out of jail. Their motivation is to not pay a substantial fine. These motivations prevent them from acting out their prejudices in discriminatory ways. So these are prejudiced non-discriminators. Now, obviously, we must also include people who are practically, if not completely free of prejudice, who do not commit acts of discrimination. Of course, that includes all of us. None of those people over on that next campus, but it's all us good guys with the white hats. We're the unprejudiced non-discriminators. Now then, one of our functions and our purposes, I assume, in being here for this 5 weeks, is to deal with prejudice and discrimination. And I would suggest that there are some growths or some changes which ought to take place in certain areas of our being, which will make us more adequate, more prepared, more equipped to do something about prejudice and discrimination. Now, I indicated that I'll put this primarily in the context of schools, and I hope we can then translate these into some other ways of living in our communities. I would suggest, first of all, that we need some growth or change in our attitudes in human relations. I used to teach, as you've heard, in Detroit, and I used to teach what they call auditorium. Detroit still has, this is a fact, you taught this too, Detroit still has a system known as a system of organization known as the platoon system. And this is a fascinating kind of thing. They don't use this in the kindergarten, but by the time the child gets to the first grade, he spends the first 66 minutes, no, I guess it's now 80 minutes. They've gotten away from 33-minute periods and shifted it over to 40-minute periods because there was such an outcry in terms of mental health and what happens to kids that there was some give on this. And they have children who, for the first 80 minutes, are with their homeroom teacher in the morning. And then for the other hour and a half in the morning, every 33 or now every 40 minutes, they run from class to class. They have something like 2 minutes to get from the art class to the music class to the gym. In the afternoon, they spend the first hour running around, and then the last hour and a half with their academic teacher. And this, you can see, is great for the legs. I'm not so sure what it does for the children as human beings. But one of the courses, one of the classes that's taught in the non-academic area is auditorium. An auditorium, you dump everything that you can't find to fit into someplace else. so that speech and dramatics and radio and safety and health and a whole variety of, in some places, human relations are all part of the auditorium setup. Perhaps the most important, or at least the most obviously recognizable thing that the auditorium teachers do, and I should add that you get double sections. You have two teachers, but you get double sections, and one teacher is supposed to be the directing teacher, the other assisting. One of the things that the auditorium does is to prepare the programs. The Christmas program, the Halloween program, the Easter program, all of the programs which are presented. And this gets to be a very interesting kind of thing. I remember one year that I was ill around Thanksgiving time, and you understand something else that happens here is that even though this is only one class, that from Thanksgiving until Christmas, nothing goes on in the school unless it's related to the auditorium program. I remember I was ill for about a week, and around Thanksgiving time, when I came back, my partner, the other auditorium teacher, said, "I've already cast the Christmas play. Would you like to see what we're doing?" I said, "Sure, fine, very good." So we had a cast of angels who were singing in the Christmas program. There was a strange kind of coincidence about these angels because all of them had blonde hair and all of them had blue eyes. They were all very cherubic, sweet, angelic-looking children. I must say that as I looked at this group, these were really angels. There wasn't any question, because I've seen pictures of angels. I haven't had much personal contact, but I know what angels look like. And I said to her, well, this is a lovely-looking group of youngsters. I said, as I remember what we were going to do, weren't these youngsters supposed to sing? Wasn't the chorus of angels supposed to sing? She said, oh, sure. And I said, well, you know, it occurs to me that Jimmy Jones in section 22 has an excellent voice, and Mary Smith up there is not so good on singing. And I remember that Jane Smith has a fine voice, and she said, what are you talking about? She said, they can't be angels. And I said, why not? She said, well, they're Negro. I thought about this for a minute, and I said, well, aren't we after the best voices we can get? She said, of course, but she said, you can't make them angels. It just doesn't fit. I said, well, Mary Jane, I said, what do you think happens to Negroes when they die? And she said, I never thought about it, but they're not going to be in my chorus. And you know, they weren't in her chorus. And they weren't in my chorus either. I think this said something rather fundamental about her attitudes in the area of race. This was a very interesting school because we had an assistant principal who was a wonderful administrator, really an excellent person. And Detroit didn't ever say this, but there seemed to be, and there was no written policy, but there seemed to be some kind of a peculiar policy where when the school population became 35%, for the first time we had Negro substitutes assigned to the school. When it became 70% Negro in the children's population, we had a Negro teacher assigned. There was no policy written about this, there was no unwritten policy, but this was always the way it happened. This school, at the time to which I refer, was about 30% Negro. And there were a couple of youngsters, 3 or 4 youngsters, some white and some Negro, who were sitting in the office for some reason, whether it was disciplinary or attendance or something else, I don't know. And this assistant principal was disclaiming at great length about the change in the school population, about the good old days, you know, when there was an all-white school, and how wonderful the children were at that time, and how things are kind of declining. She didn't directly attack the whole business of integration in the school, but there wasn't any question what she was talking about. And she ended this rather important declamation by saying, and the first day that one of them walks in here as a teacher is the day that I'm going to walk out. I think she told us a good deal about her own attitudes, and I think that there's some need for growth or change in her attitudes. I think the good Lord has some wondrous ways of doing things, however, because the following year there was a great shift in organization in the Detroit Public Schools, and she was moved from that school and assigned to a totally Negro school. I never saw her again, but I often wondered about the retribution element that was involved in this transfer. I also wonder what happened to the attitudes of those children who sat right there and listened to this, both the Negro and the white children. Sometimes this business of attitudes and sensitivity, and I think it was coming out in a rather interesting way in the discussion that I listened to earlier today, sometimes these attitudes are not at the overt level. Sometimes this lack of sensitivity comes about not because anybody wants to do any harm, but because things seem to be a good idea. I mention this particularly because yesterday we had a very interesting experience as we drove down here from Chicago. We came through a town called Winnemac. Is that the correct name? We came through Winnemac. I noticed an interesting sign or the sign was repeated on several of the storefronts. And they said that next Friday and Saturday, August the 10th and 11th, they're going to be celebrating Maxwell Street Days. How many of you know what Maxwell Street Days are? Well, this is an interesting kind of device. Maxwell Street is a neighborhood which is heavily populated by Jews on the west side of Chicago. And Maxwell Street has push carts out in front of on the sidewalk from the stores, like Delancey Street or Orchard Street in New York. And you can go there and get very good bargains, or the other way around, depending on how sharp you are. About 1955, I heard about Maxwell Street Day, which was being held in Paw Paw, Michigan. So I went to see Maxwell Street Day, and what the merchants do, for years they have Golden Frontier Days, and some of you may remember, most of you look too young to remember Davy Crockett Days, where they had there was a period where all our kids were wearing Davy Crockett hats. But in the Maxwell Street Day, apparently one of the local merchants had visited Maxwell Street and came back with the idea of having a real hotshot promotion in Paw Paw. The way this worked was that they first set up the push carts on the main street, which happened to be US 12, one of the major highways across the state. And the merchants came out and they put on black skull caps or derbies. They wore long black frock coats. All day long they talked with their hands, and they talked with what they considered to be Jewish accents. They wore hooked noses, and you were supposed to go up to the merchant and say, "How much is that item?" And he would tell you, and then you'd say, "Well, I got to Jew you down on this." I went in and talked with some of the local people who were horrified to discover that anybody should object to this kind of stereotyping, which incidentally was the reason that the Anti-Defamation League was established in the first place in 1913, to attempt to do away with stereotyped caricatures of American Jews. Now, Winnemac, this is not by the board, and it's a very difficult kind of thing to eradicate, because people say, "Look, we don't mean anything by this. Some of my best friends are Jews. I play golf with the local Jewish hardware merchant. We have the Jewish rabbi, or your Jewish rabbi comes in and talks about Judaism. I love the Jews. There's nothing wrong with this, and we're not really talking about our Jews. We're talking about those Jews out there." We were talking before about the whole business of not ever having to know Jews or anybody in order to have a generalized stereotype. Now, many of the people in these very tiny communities have no contact with Jews, but they know all about them through television, through radio, through comic books, and a whole variety of ways. They know about them. I think that this is the kind of attitudinal structure which, in my judgment, ought to be revised. And I am not suggesting that the people who do this or who bring this about are really anti-Semitic or anti-Jewish or really vicious or nasty in their attitudes, and yet through this lack of sensitivity they do something which is, to say the least, offensive. Let me go on to a second area where I think we need some growth, some change, some revision. And that's the area of knowledge. we really know so little about the other person and what he believes and what he's like that it's appalling. Not too long ago, a questionnaire was circulated. A research project was undertaken at one of the large Midwestern universities, which I must admit tends toward engineering and science and mechanical training of various kinds. So you say these people perhaps are less likely to know about humanitarian elements in our society. But even so, one of the questions that was included in the questionnaire was, do you believe that there is such a thing as a superior race? These are college professors, remember, and 1 out of 5 said yes. Now, I think that we have reached a stage in civilization where we learned, if nothing else from Hitler, we learned that there is no such thing as a superior race, genealogically, biologically, any other way. Yet, 1 out of 5, 20% of this particular college's faculty answered yes. This is an appalling lack of information, of knowledge. Incidentally, if I sound to you as if I'm unbiased, I don't mean to. I'm not unbiased at all. I'm on the side of the angels, and I believe that we have to solve our intergroup problems, and we have to solve them pretty fast. So I had to go through a whole period years ago where when I first got in to the human relations field as a volunteer and then later as a professional person, I used to go out and think it's important to have people like me and like what I say so that they'll invite me back again. The only problem with this, though I was very cautious about how I talked, the only problem with this is that sooner or later you get to a point where you have to decide how far you're going to sacrifice principle for expediency. So if there are some of the things that I say with which you don't agree and with which you don't like, I'm sorry, but I have to say what I believe is so, and which I hope I can document. Let me go on to this business of knowledge. I remember a very critical situation we had with one school in which a little girl came late one day, and she took her seat. The teacher didn't say anything about it. During the recess period, and this was about a second grade, as I remember, during the recess period, the children were out in the playground, and the teacher noticed that there was a group of children, and there was kind of a commotion going on, but she didn't pay too much attention to it until this little girl who had come in late broke away from the group and was tears streaming down her face, rushing madly across the playground, and ran right into the teacher. And the teacher said, "Mary, what's the matter?" And she said, "The children are teasing me and they're making my life miserable," and so on. She said, "Why?" She said, "Well, because they say my face is dirty." And the teacher said, "Well, now that I take a look at you, it does seem to me your face is kind of dirty. Why don't you go in and wash up?" The little girl said, I can't. And she said, "Now, Mary, that's silly. Now you go on into school and you wash your face and you come out and play with the children again." The little girl rushed away from her into the school and out the other door. She didn't come back at the end of the recess period, but about 15 minutes later she came back with her mother. And the roof just about fell in, because it turned out that this was Ash Wednesday. And the little girl's face was a little dirty. But this teacher really didn't have this kind of fundamental knowledge. And I think that if we have people who don't have this kind of knowledge, that there is a need for growth or change in this whole area. Let me go on to the third area where I think there is some critical need for shifts in the human relations field, and that's the whole area of skills. And I'm a little disturbed about skills because people, all of us, tend to look for the easy way. You know, we say, "Give me the skills. What do I do first, second, third? I'll do it," and that's all there is to it. I'm not at all sure that this is enough to know the skills. I remember seeing somebody do a rumor clinic. This person obviously had some very deep biases of her own, and I think that she did damage. She knew the skill well. She knew how to do a rumor clinic, but in the discussion and in the projecting of some of her own feelings, some of her own attitudes, and some of her own lack of knowledge, I think she did more harm than she did good by having this skill. So I'm suggesting that attitudes and knowledges and skills go together, that they are interlocked, they are interwoven. And I am fundamentally committed to the notion that we don't try skills until we have some revision in the other areas. Let me talk about skills, and I suppose in some cases they're devices. I don't know about you. When I went to what was then called normal college, and then it became normal school, and then it became teachers college, I got courses in methods of teaching, and I got courses in philosophy of education. I got courses in the subject matter which I was going to teach, arithmetic and spelling and reading and so on. Well, what I didn't get was a whole thing that's very important in schools, and that's how to collect milk money, and how to run a Red Cross campaign, and how to collect for the community chest, and so on. They never taught me any of this in the College of Education. But those of you who teach know that you do as much of this as you do of the other thing about methods and so on. You had Allison Davis here. I've sat in classrooms where up on the teacher's desk was a big box or a bottle with fancy crepe paper or painted or whatever, and the teacher the first thing in the morning after collecting the milk money would say, now we're in the midst of our Red Cross or Community Chest or United Fund campaign, whatever you want. Now, we're ready to collect the contributions now. Who has $1 to give? And one little tyke in the back of the room walks proudly up to the front of the room and drops his $1 into the box. Maybe he gets a gold star on a chart up on the wall, and maybe he's got a whole string of these. Then we go to the 75 censors, and then the 50 censors, and we get down to where there are a couple of kids who don't got nothing. And I wonder, in terms of our skills, or our devices, or our techniques, what we do to these youngsters. And of course, this same youngster then goes and swipes a couple of bucks from the teacher's purse and gets caught at it, and he's a real bad boy. So we fortify this feeling of lack of self-respect or lack of self-concept, whatever you'd like to call it. I remember getting a complaint from a mother about segregation in the classroom. And I went out with her, and we talked about this, and she said, this teacher is segregating all of the Negro children in her classroom. So we went out, she and I went out to meet with the principal on this, and the principal was horrified. She said, this is a wonderful teacher. She's been to a human relations workshop. She knows and understands about all of this. I just don't understand. This is the fact. This is the truth. So we went up to the teacher's room and looked through the door with a big glass in it. We looked through, and sure enough, here there were about 5 Negro children in that class, and all of them were sitting in the row by the window. So the mother said, see, here's the proof. And the principal said, I can see it, but I just don't understand this. And she called the teacher down, and we began talking about this, and it turned out that it was a very simple kind of thing that had occurred. You know, when you teach reading, you teach it in different groups. You know, you have the mockingbirds and the bumblebees and the turtles, and incidentally, don't think that you're kidding anybody. You're certainly not kidding the children. They know it's better to be a mockingbird than a turtle. And it turned out that all of the Negro children were turtles. So the easiest thing to do, because we had reading the first thing in the morning, was to put the children into groups. And they stayed in those groups all day long. These were their permanent seats. Now, it would have been a fairly simple kind of thing to shift seats for spelling or for arithmetic or for something else. Again, this was not anything vicious on the part of the teacher. As a matter of fact, she was terribly upset about this, that anybody should think that she would perpetuate segregation, and yet seemingly this is what she was doing. I've been giving you some pretty negative kinds of examples. Let me give you one that I think is very positive. I went to a conference, a weekend conference one time, and a friend of mine who worked for the State Department of Instruction said, I want you to meet somebody. He took me over and introduced me to a little lady who stood about this high, really, white-haired. And he said, this is Miss So-and-so. She's had 40 years of experience in teaching, and she's had a wonderful thing happen. Incidentally, I should clarify there are two kinds of teachers. There's one kind who's had 40 years of experience, and there's one kind who's had 1 year of experience repeated 40 times. Now, this lady had had 40 years of experience. And she said, oh, it wasn't anything. And he said, go on, tell him about it. Well, it seemed that she had a second or a third grade class, and one of the boys came to school one day and had developed some scalp ailment, ringworm or something of this kind, and he had to have his whole head shaved. Well, he lasted for perhaps 45 minutes that first day. The other children had some choice comments to make, and he went home, and he wasn't coming back under any circumstances. So she visited his home that afternoon and talked with him and with his parents, and he was adamant. He wasn't going back, and he wasn't going to let the kids call him Baldy, and he wasn't going to let any of these other kinds of things happen. So then she did something that I think probably exhibited a lack of dignity, which I think really exemplified some basic dignity and respect for human beings. You've seen these gaily colored caps that golfers wear, plaids and reds and greens and blues. She went out and she bought 2 of these, and she came back to the little boy with a proposition. She said, now look, it's going to take about 6 weeks for your hair to grow in. I can understand why you don't want to go to school with no hair at all. But if you'll wear this cap until your hair grows in, I'll wear one exactly like it. And he thought about it, and he said, that sounds like a pretty good idea. Now, I suspect that during that next 6 weeks, anybody walking by her room would have thought she was some kind of a nut. But this boy really got support and feeling and sensitivity, and I suppose this is a skill that she administered, which was a very positive kind of thing. Let me say something about the whole business of conflict. I think we sometimes have a notion that conflict or negative learning experiences are bad. And certainly in this country, we attempt to avoid conflict in every way that we know how. And we attempt to swaddle children in cotton battens so that they don't have unfortunate things happen to them. I think this is unrealistic. We can't literally keep children or adults from having unfortunate experiences. And you're going to have, if you haven't already had some in this workshop, you're going to have some conflicts. Don't misunderstand. I'm not saying that I'm for race riots. At the same time, had it not been for the 1943 race riot in Detroit, and the reason I'm not for that one is because I got a little scar on my head from where I got hit on the head with a brick. And I lost many friends in the 34 people who were killed, and there were an awful lot of people who lost a great deal in goods in the $50 million worth of property that was destroyed. Nevertheless, out of that conflict, for the first time, the city of Detroit and later the state of Michigan said, we have to do something about human relations in our community. A committee was established, which later became a city commission. An ordinance was passed. The schools, for the first time, saw a responsibility in this area. The labor unions, management, industry, everybody, for the first time, as a result of this kind of Holocaust, decided that there was something that ought to happen. So I'm suggesting here that conflict was used creatively in the long run. Let me give you another little story. I once got a complaint from a mother who came to my office and said, you've got to go over to this school because there's a viciously anti-Semitic teacher over there. And I said, oh, really? What are the circumstances? She says, my child came home, and immediately my hackles went up because I know what this my child came home means. I've got a couple of teenagers, and you should hear about their teachers. Boy. She said, my child came home and told me about this teacher who came in and was choosing children for a particular job, and she said in front of the entire group that she would not have any child who had a Jewish face. Well, this certainly sounded like the worst kind of anti-Semitism on the part of this teacher, so again, I traipsed over to the schools. I had pats worn from my office to an awful lot of the schools in the city. We went over to this one, and the principal said, I can't believe this. Good gal, and so on and so on. So she invited the teacher in, and it turned out that what had happened was that the teacher was in charge of the safety patrol. And a couple of days before the Jewish High Holy Day, she had gone around from class to class to get substitutes for the Jewish children who would not be in school on that day. And she came around and she asked for substitutes for the safety patrol, but she said it's very important that these not be children of the Jewish faith, because they're not going to be here. By the time the kid got to his home, you see, no children with Jewish faces. Well, the situation was clarified, there was no problem. Or was there? Because if this youngster had this impression, how many others had it? The principal then mounted what I consider to be a very positive educational campaign in which they took this incident and throughout the school they discussed whether there are physically inherited characteristics which are related to one's religious faith, whether you really can tell a Jew by looking at him, what the whole concept of racial or religious or ethnic or social class identification has to do with good human relations. And I think she took a potentially negative learning experience with the help of a very competent staff, translated this into a positive experience. Now, I think that we can, as human relations-oriented people, operate in somewhat this same fashion. Obviously, we don't want kids knifing each other or beating each other up, particularly when these are related to intergroup or human relations aspects of everyday living. But when these things do happen, if we have what I have suggested in terms of the positive attitudes toward other people and toward ourselves, if we have the basic knowledge and if we have the skills, then I think that we can translate these into most positive experiences, and we can do this not only with children, but with adults as well. Maybe this is a good point for me to stop. I told you it was an occupational hazard. After you've been in this business for a few years, the sound you like the most is that of your own voice, so I'm restricting myself. Let me stop, and maybe there's some questions you'd like to raise or some discussion.
What was your capacity right there when you were walking back and forth between different schools?
What was my capacity when I was walking back and forth to these various schools?
What was your job?
I was the Bob Gordon of the state of Michigan.
Problem itself.
I was the Michigan Regional Director for the Anti-Defamation League, and a number of complaints or a number of requests for service or for assistance. We did a great deal in the way of positive programming too, you see.
We're supposed to understand each other's theology. I'd like to ask you or Bob, part of Hebrew theology that when children die, they become angels. I was fascinated.
My theological friend will respond to that.
Well, Maria, replace your watch with a calendar and let's discuss the theology of Judaism as it relates to the question of immortality. Really, it depends on three things. From a Jewish point of view now, Orthodox Judaism accepts the idea of a heaven and hell and the whole idea of angels and archangels and a bunch of other things. This process is undergoing change. Conservative Judaism, this is a kind of middle-of-the-road Judaism, accepts some of this and not all of it, but it does accept the idea of the immortal soul of man, and is still wrestling theologically with where this soul may go. Reform Judaism says, pay your nickel and take your choice. You want to believe in the idea of a heaven and hell, you may. You want to reject the idea of a heaven and hell, you may. But fundamentally, in terms of the theology that's involved here, we don't accept it. We accept the idea that man creates his own heaven and his own hell. Now, from this point of view, you can get a point of view about angels.
But what I was thinking, though, nowhere along the line, if angels are believed in, they are created beings, is not in the sense that human beings become angels, is it? I guess this is rather facetious, but Dr. Sobel spoke of he was surprised that the teacher didn't know that little black children in heaven, whatever you think of heaven, if there are angels, would look like any other angels. But I wasn't aware that anybody anymore thought of children dying and becoming angels.
She did. You see, and this is what's important. If she believed that there was a heaven with angels, whether there is or not is relatively unimportant. What she was projecting What I'm saying is that her attitude was that good Negroes don't die and become angels in heaven. And whether we do or do not. Well, let me go on to something else, though, that I think you've raised a rather critical question here. We talk about Jews. We talk about them rather continually, I think, as a religious group. And we talk about the Jews. I think it's important to recognize that there's no such thing as the Jew. Bob has mentioned that there are Reformed Jews, there are conservative Jews, there are Orthodox Jews, there are unchurched Jews, there are secular Jews. Yes, I understand. I'm projecting this a little further. You know, there are gastronomical Jews whose only relationship with Judaism is that on Sunday morning they eat bagels and lox. I have a friend who has another type of Jews. He's a rabbi, and he tells me that he has some members of his congregation who say to him, "Rabbi, why is it necessary for me to go to services? Why do I have to be a part of this mob? Why do I have to have drummed at me all of the time that I am a Jew and that my religion is important? I feel my religion in my heart." And he calls these cardiac Jews. I've repeated this a couple of times to friends of mine in the Protestant and Catholic clergy who say, yes, I know some cardiac Catholics and cardiac Protestants too. So you get all kinds of Jews, many of whom, as myself, cannot respond to a theological question. I just don't know that much. Although I'm a member of a synagogue, my kids have gone to Sunday school, have gone through the processes. This just happens not to be one of my knowledges. Now, Bob is far better qualified than I, but I think that when we talk about Jews, we have to recognize that Jews are really, in our society, in the United States, a cultural, ethnic group with a fundamental tie which binds them together, and which tie is of a religious nature.
I think the point I was trying to make, this is very interesting. I think we're still separate, and that is that as the teacher was casting for angels, she was casting according to her stereotype of what angels look like, but the fact that human children become angels is actually not part of it. So whether Negro children become beautiful little blonde, blue-eyed angels is not the point, because in any kind of Christian background that had any adequacy whatsoever, nobody becomes an angel. There are angels. I mean, this is a point that doesn't distinct. That's what I...
No, but the point in my set of values is that if you're going to have angels, it ought to be an integrated heaven.
Well, again, I'm not convincing John. I'm not
Yes.
Saying if they're going to be angels, it's going to be an integrated heaven, irrespective of whether human beings become angels or not.
Yes.
Do you find examples or principles when you're invited in to settle difficulties in the various schools?
Well, first of all, I don't go in, or haven't in the past, gone in any kind of antagonistic fashion. We haven't gotten into the whole business of tactics and strategy and approaches and so on. So I have had rare occasions in which the principal or the teacher has become defensive. As a matter of fact, I suspect the more frequently, in my experience at least, the more frequently expressed attitude is, we ain't got no problems. You know, here everybody loves everybody. Very often they'll say, we have no Catholics, we have no Jews, we have no Negroes. What kind of problems have we got? And if you should happen to raise the question as to why you don't have any and whether this isn't a problem in itself, then there's something wrong with my perceptions, you see. I think this is a more pervasive kind of attitude than one of resentment or hostility. You see, today everybody wants to be a good guy, and if it appears that, we all want to be good Americans, and if it appears that something is wrong, then let's do away with this wrong thing, which will make me a better person. Yes?
Lord, is it possible to think without stereotypes? We do this to simplify complex situations. And if you're reasonably intelligent, you know that we're oversimplifying. And yet I keep thinking, when I picture an Englishman, I'm aware that they're individuals. And yet I think of certain traits. The Englishman is stir. The Englishman likes his tea, he likes stability. He likes a number of things. When I think of my own self, I think of all the jokes they make about the Scotsman. I know why he's so tight. I've been there and I've seen what you have to do to rest for a living. You got to be tight in order to survive and so on. And I keep wondering, what are we going to put in place of a stereotype? It seems to me we leave a vacuum if we destroy it. I see why they grew up. Not to poke fun at the other guy, but to make him more simple than he is so that we can attempt to talk about him at all.
Well, I would quite agree that we need certain kinds of stereotypes in order to function in our society. I mentioned before, I have a daughter who's a junior at Penn State, and I have another daughter who's a sophomore in high school. Now, it's brought home to me very forcibly every single day that they have certain stereotypes about what boys are like. And I think they need these stereotypes in order to function. If they didn't have them, I think males in our society have to have some generalized stereotypes about what women are like and how they'll react in certain kinds of situations and so on. I mean, we all know about women drivers, for example. We all know about mothers-in-law, and perhaps we need to. And incidentally, don't let facts interfere with my prejudices, you see. However, I think what's important about stereotypes is not the stereotype itself, but how we use that stereotype. You know, there's a whole big to-do about comedians using minority group stereotypes in jokes on television, on radio, and so on and so on. I consider many of these to be quite offensive. At the same time, I recognize that there are certain kinds of jokes in which this makes it a more where it's relevant to the content of the joke. I think there are two factors that enter into this business of the stereotype joke. One of these has to do with whether this joke or skit or whatever it is perpetuates a negative stereotype. And if it perpetuates a negative stereotype, then I don't want to see it there. And don't misunderstand, I'm a dyed-in-the-wool civil libertarian. I'm opposed to censorship. I'm opposed to book burning. And I'm also opposed to projecting negative stereotypes about groups. I think a second factor that enters into this is what you might call the degree of vulnerability. I think that stereotype jokes about Scotchmen in our society are less likely to be hurtful because of the status of the Scotsman in our society. He's reached a status where he's less vulnerable, where he's not on the receiving end in quite the same way as, for example, the American Negro or the American Puerto Rican. I think there years ago, the stereotype jokes were about Germans and about drunk, brawling Irishmen, and so on. Today, these kinds of jokes are not as offensive because of the degree of vulnerability of the group. Thirdly, I think that if the content of the joke is not related to the minority aspect, then why do this? So that I hear jokes about sexual precocity that time after time after time have to include Negroes. Why? This has nothing to do with the content of the joke, except that it perpetuates this kind of a negative stereotype. Now, there's some jokes where you have to include the minority content. You know, there's an old joke about a couple of fellows who were talking, and one said to the other, I heard a wonderful joke about a couple of Jews who were walking down the street, and the other fellow said, now, wait a minute, I don't listen to stereotype jokes. Why does there always have to be two Jews walking down the street? Why can't it be two Chinese? Another fellow thought about it for a minute, and he said, all right. He said, there were two Chinese walking down the street, and one said to the other, Nu Oiving, where are you going to shul for Yom Kippur? Now, I suspect, without hearing the rest of that joke, that it was rather important that there be a couple of Jews in it, you see. Now, I think this, in terms of what I'm saying about stereotypes, is not the stereotype per se, but it's what we do with it, and it's how we use it that's critical and important.
You mentioned the anti-defamation rate. Would you mind telling us more about this in respect to what you do? Is it restricted to Jews? Are you happy with what they're doing?
Are you talking about salary levels and things like this? Oh.
You know what I mean.
Well, the Anti-Defamation League of B'nai B'rith, and this is the full title, it's important to remember, I think, is the community relations and human relations and education arm of B'nai B'rith. Now, B'nai B'rith itself is a service organization. It includes in this country about 400,000 men, women, and teenagers. And they support the Hillel Foundations in part on college campuses. They have overseas AIDS programs, they have veterans programs, they have social, and it's kind of a Jewish Knights of Columbus, if you can imagine. And it operates a whole variety of service, philanthropic, you'll excuse the expression, probably. It operates a whole series of these kinds of functions. It's now located in, I think, 36 countries around the world. It was wiped out in Europe during the Nazi period and has been reestablished. The two words are two Hebrew words, B'nai B'rith, which means sons of the covenant. And it's a covenant of benevolence, brotherly love, and harmony. Now, B'nai B'rith is now in it was founded in 1843. Next year it'll be 120 years old. The Anti-Defamation League was founded in 1913. Next year we'll be celebrating our 50th anniversary. And incidentally, when I use the term we, you understand this is an editorial we. I've not been with them since 1913. But we have been in the business of dealing, first of all, with this matter of caricatured stereotyping of Jews. A B'nai B'rith member in Chicago named Sigmund Livingston walked into a theater, a vaudeville theater, and at that time it was very common in a vaudeville theater, what movies there were, and the mass media of communication, to see one character who, like in the Maxwell Street days, wore the skull cap or the derby, talked with his hands, had a large hook nose, and always turned out to be the guy who cheated everybody else. He wanted to do away with this, and this was the reason for originally establishing an anti-defamation committee in his B'nai B'rith Lodge of 5 members. Out of this has come today's Anti-Defamation League of B'nai B'rith, which is comprised of 25 regional offices around the country and a national staff. Now, the regional offices are on a geographical basis, so the Bob's territory is the state of Indiana. Mine was the lower peninsula of Michigan. We have an office in Omaha which goes to services in Nebraska and Kansas and Iowa, you know, a whole variety of areas. Some of these offices have 4, 5, 6, 8, 10 professional people plus clericals. When the stereotyping, well, I should say this, that we have about 200 employees. They are about equally divided between professional personnel and clerical. They're about equally divided between national staff people who are specialists. I only work in the area of higher education, and the field staff who are generalists and work across the board. One of my colleagues says that we're also about equally divided between competence and incompetence. Now, I'm not sure whether he meant this for real. The ADL has gone through 3 major stages. The first was this business of the stereotyping and doing away with caricatures. The second was the stage during the 30s and the early 40s, and actually during the war years, where we were terribly concerned about the neo-Nazi movement in this country, the Hitler sympathizers, the German-American Bund, the organized hate movement. And we actually went through a period where it was necessary to provide bodyguards for American Jews to get to and from work without getting their heads beat in. After the Nazi Holocaust, I think that what happened was that the world was shocked and horrified at this, and to a substantial degree, the organized hate movement in this country ain't what it used to be at all. It still exists, and they still pick up during the McCarthyism era. All Jews were communists, and these guys got a shot in the arm. During the desegregation crises, this was a plot of the international Jewish conspiracy to mongrelize the white race. But decent people today just don't buy this kind of thing. So we began to examine, as an agency, whether or not we had a function any longer, whether anti-Semitism is not by the board. And the ADL came to the rather substantial conclusion that, number one, anti-Semitism is not by the board, that all that's happened is that it's changed its face so that instead of the Gerald L.K. Smiths and the Camps and the Harts and these people making a substantial impact on the American community, we now have the gentle people of prejudice, people who politely operate in the areas of discrimination and foster discrimination and have institutions of discrimination which are of the more subtle kind. We also decided that you can't really be a defense agency, which is a special pleading vested interest group. You can't just say we fight for the rights or we are attempting to secure the rights of Jews as a group. Because we saw what happened to us, to Jews under communism, we saw what happened under fascism, and we are pretty well committed to the notion that only under democracy, where the rights and security and well-being of Jews are tightly interwoven with the rights and security and well-being of all people, minority and majority, only in such a situation can we really operate effectively and can we really preserve the fundamental democratic ideals, and this is where we're best off. So we have become an intergroup education agency. I came out of 15 years of education. The fact that I was willing to join the ADL and that they were willing to have me, I think, is an indication of the change in trend in the agency. There's some of the old-timers, the ex-FBI men and the civil rights specialists and the professional investigators who say that the agency's gone to pot because now we've got teachers and sociologists and psychologists and all of these egghead nuts working for us. I think that all of these egghead nuts have changed the agency at the same time that the agency has been changing. Now, am I satisfied with what the ADL does? I don't know whether I'm an idealist or not, but if I didn't believe that we could achieve good human relations, if I thought this was just a holding action for all of us and that we weren't really going to achieve this millennium, I couldn't stay in this business. If I didn't think that the ADL was the best agency in terms of doing this job, I couldn't stay with the ADL. So what I'm saying is that while I'm not happy with everything that the ADL does, because they don't always do what I want them to do. You see, if they did what I